it doesn't work for a variety of kind of reasons.
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So where are my downloads? Hang on. Sorry. Oh, when you lose drafts of your own papers. Okay. So that's. So hang on. Paper 1 is the Kim argument.
Okay, we are live, by the way.
Yeah, I'll stop talking now. Remember the baby?
What's that?
Are we allowed to talk about that kind of stuff now that we're live? Like personal.
That's fine. That's fine with me. But
I was just saying how you're doing in light of the baby, if you're getting enough sleep.
oh, I'm definitely not getting enough sleep, but the baby's doing well. She's sort of learning how to sleep. Yeah, pretty sleep deprived right now though.
Is this your first
No,
child?
this is actually our fourth child. So not my first rodeo, but
yeah. I have 4 children too.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Cool. What? How old?
So the youngest is going to turn 3 in 2 weeks, and the oldest is teenager.
Oh, nice.
I mean, yeah, the sleep gets better.
Yeah.
How old are yours, the other ones?
So they're 7, 5, 2, and 3 weeks now.
Very
and
close to each other.
We've gotten a lot better at sleep training the kids as they've come. So.
Okay. Alex, are you happy to chair today?
Is it cool if I go ahead and share my screen now?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Let's do that
right away. But
I might have to do something to make that possible. Hang on. I know, almost you can do that, can't you?
No, we already did that.
Is that showing up?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, then I will mute myself and leave it to Alex to take it from here when Brian is ready.
1 second.
Sure.
And then... Why is life so hard sometimes? So I think that's the right version. Okay, final thing. Okay, great. So Brian, I just sent you a bunch of stuff. It's all relevant to our shared interests.
Great.
So you can flick through what looks relevant and what's not. So for example, there's a paper I gave in this series last week. There's a recorded talk knocking around on the channel if you want to have, look at that while you're doing stuff rather than read the paper, maybe of more interesting or like save you time than reading the paper.
Is that the supervenience one?
Yeah, but it's got like I think it's of some intrinsic interest, plus like there are questions, it's transposable into My own view is that that kind of problem will arise for like the colors and not just the mental and physical. But
Oh, yeah.
and then there's everything else. But I have a little walkthrough in the email I've sent to you, so you could let me know after your talk if you've gotten that email or not.
Cool.
Okay, great. Should we wait a couple minutes, or are we?
No, I think we are already 5 minutes past.
Okay,
We have the normal
10
number
seconds.
of people. Yeah, I think we can start if Brian is okay to start.
Yeah, I'm ready.
I think. Oh yeah, yes. Let me just introduce you, Brian. I think Alex just disappeared.
I'm here.
You're here. Sorry,
Sorry.
I lost you for a second. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, internet. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you all for coming as usual. This week we are welcoming Brian Cotter to speak to us about the value of consciousness, and in particular, we have an axiological argument against reductive materialism. So, Brian, please take it away.
All right, thanks for inviting me, and I'm glad I could be a part of this. Okay, so the starting point for my talk is the idea that consciousness is axiologically significant, at least in the sense that certain experiences, certain phenomenal states can possess intrinsic value or disvalue, which is to say just that they can be good or bad sort of in themselves in a non-instrumental way. And the question I want to address in this talk is, does the axiological significance of consciousness have any metaphysical significance? In other words, does it have any bearing on traditional metaphysical questions about the nature of consciousness? And I'm going to argue that the answer is yes. And in particular, I'm going to argue that the axiological significance of consciousness provides some grounds for rejecting reductive materialist views of consciousness. So a bit more specifically, I'm going to put forward what I call the axiological argument. Broadly speaking, the axiological argument relies on intuitions to the effect that certain phenomenal states differ from their physical correlates with respect to their intrinsic value, with respect to whether or not they have certain evaluative properties. And therefore, by Leibniz's law, they aren't identical. So officially, we'll put forward the argument as a simple two-premise argument. The first premise I call the value thesis. Some phenomenal states, such as an experience of ecstatic joy or an experience of excruciating pain, possess intrinsic value or disvalue. They're good or bad in a non-instrumental way. Second is what I call the no value thesis. The physical correlates of these phenomenal states, that is those referenced in the value thesis, do not possess intrinsic value or disvalue, at least not to anything like the same degree. Therefore, some phenomenal states are not identical to any of their physical correlates. So there's going to be a lot of things to say along the way, a lot of subtleties to address in clarifying and defending the premises, but the basic underlying idea here is extremely simple-minded. So on the one hand, it seems intuitively plausible that certain phenomenal states, pleasure and pain being perhaps the clearest examples, are good or bad sort of intrinsically in a non-instrumental way. On the other hand, when we consider the purely physical correlates of these states, the neurobiological correlates or functional computational correlates of these states, and we consider them in themselves in terms of their real physical nature, these states just seem to us intuitively not to have the same degree of intrinsic value or disvalue. So we've got a pair of intuitions that furnish the materials for a simple Leibniz's law argument against reductive materialism. That's the kind of the guiding simple-minded thought here. So the big idea here that there's a kind of conflict between reductive materialism and certain common sense views about the value of consciousness makes contact with a number of recent works that have inspired me in different ways in this project. So first of all, Jeff Lee, in a number of recent papers, has argued that reductive materialism is in tension with the intuition that consciousness has a distinctive kind of moral and also epistemic and natural significance, at least in comparison with certain kind of nearby very similar physical states that aren't conscious. Adam Pouts has argued that reductive materialism is in tension with certain common sense beliefs about the normative significance of consciousness. Most of his work is focused mainly on the epistemic dimensions of the normative significance of consciousness. Here I focus more on the moral dimensions. Francois Kemmerer has argued that illusionism faces a challenge accommodating certain common sense claims about the value of consciousness. Illusionism isn't quite the same as my target here of reductive materialism, but it's at least a close relative to reductive materialism. And William Seeger, Jonathan Simon, and myself in some earlier work have argued in different ways that certain forms of materialism conflict with certain common sense claims about the value of conscious states. So all of these works make some contact with the argument here, but all of them kind of come at the point from a slightly different angle, using slightly different considerations than the axiological argument here. So before I launch into clarification and defense of the axiological argument, it's going to be helpful to clarify some key bits of terminology just very quickly here. So we'll say that a physical property is any property corresponding to a predicate expressible with the canonical vocabulary of the physical sciences, plus any property that can be defined by way of kind of functional descriptions that make use of quantification over other physical properties. So as I use the term physical property is a kind of understood broadly to include functional properties in addition to their lower level material realizers. A phenomenal property, we'll treat these as properties of individual subjects like you and me that characterize in part or in whole what it's like to be a subject at a time. And then we'll want a notion of a token physical or phenomenal state. We'll just treat these as token instantiations of physical or phenomenal properties by an individual at a time. It's going to be useful for our purposes to assume that these states are individuated by the properties, individuals, and times that they involve. That is to say that the token state of A is having F at T, we'll take that to be identical to the token state of B is having G at T star, if and only if A is identical to B, F is identical to G, and T is identical to T star. Okay, so with that in hand, we can now give a kind of first pass definition of reductive materialism, which is my main target in this talk. So at a first pass, we can say reductive materialism is the view that phenomenal properties are identical to high-level physical properties, that is, physical properties of relatively macroscopic physical systems, things like organisms, brains, nervous systems, things along those lines. That's a first pass definition. A bit more adequate will be the claim that phenomenal properties can be reduced to or reductively identified with high-level physical properties. So this qualification is needed because I take it that identity is not sufficient for reduction. So identity is symmetric in a way that reduction is not. So if identity is not sufficient for reduction, the question arises like, what exactly does reduction add to mere identity? That's a tricky question. It's not going to be a question that I'll give a complete answer to here, but I will at least assume this much. So I'll assume that if we've got a psychophysical identification of the form to be psi is to be phi, where psi is some phenomenal predicate, maybe being in pain, phi is some physical predicate, like having firing C fibers, I'm going to assume that this qualifies as a reduction of being psi to being phi, only if the physical characterization of the property in some sense better captures or more perspicuously reveals the property's true nature, what it is to have that property. Now, this talk of better capturing or more perspicuously revealing the real nature of a property is a little bit slippery, but I think we can usefully get on to the concept with some useful heuristics about kind of an epistemic asymmetry that should be involved in reductions. So the basic idea is something like this. If you're a reductive materialist, you want to accept these psychophysical identifications as reductions, then you think that when one learns that to be in pain is to have firing C fibers, just for example, one thereby learns something about the true nature of pain. You get a better idea of what it is to be in pain, but you don't necessarily get a better idea of what it is to have firing C fibers. You might have had a perfectly adequate grasp of that all along. By analogy here, suppose you think that heat is reducible to molecular motion. Well, if you think that, it's very natural to think that, well, when you learn that to be hot is to have moving molecules, roughly, you thereby learn something about the nature of heat. You get a better understanding of what it is for something to be hot, but you don't get a better understanding, at least necessarily, of what it is for something's molecules to move. Presumably, you had a perfectly adequate understanding of what it is for something's molecules to move all along. Now, since identity is not sufficient for reduction, it's going to be possible in principle to accept psychophysical identities without accepting them as reductions, or at least not as reductions of the phenomenal to the physical. And some theorists, and in particular some Russellian identity theorists, do exactly that. So they'll accept psychophysical identity claims like being in pain as having firing C fibers, but in my sense, they wouldn't treat these as reductions of being in pain to having firing C fibers, because they would deny that in learning this, you get a better understanding of the nature of pain or what it is to be in pain. So some Russellian identity theorists will say things like, merely by having the experience of pain or by introspecting on it and grasping it under phenomenal concepts, you thereby have a perfectly adequate grasp of what it is to be in pain. When we learn that being in pain is having firing C fibers, maybe we learn something new about what it really is to have firing C fibers, but we don't necessarily get a better grasp of what it is to be in pain. So if you accept that kind of Russellian identity theory or anything in that ballpark, you would not qualify as a reductive materialist in my sense. And this sort of view I don't take to be among the targets of this talk. Maybe it's worth noting that this sort of view, or any view that accepts psychophysical identities, is incompatible with the conclusion of my axiological argument. So in that sense, it might seem to be a target. But the reason I don't take this sort of view to be among my targets is that for reasons that will emerge later, I think the Russellian identity theorist has a promising response to the axiological argument in a way that the reductive materialist does not. One final point of clarification about the reductive materialist thesis. So as I use the term reductive materialism, and this is in contrast to the way some people use this term, as I use the term, reductive materialism is meant to be broader than traditional type identity theories. It's also supposed to cover role functionalist theories of the sort that are standardly motivated by multiple realizability considerations. So in my sense of the term reductive materialism, the main alternative to reductive materialism, not quite the only alternative, but the main one for our purposes, is what you could call the primitivist view that phenomenal properties can't be reductively analyzed in non-phenomenal terms. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's turn to the actual argument. So remember, the first premise of the argument is the value thesis. Remember, the value thesis says that some phenomenal states, such as an experience of ecstatic joy or an experience of excruciating pain, possess intrinsic value or disvalue. They can be good or bad in a not merely instrumental way. So the value thesis presupposes, or at least entails, a minimal realism about value. That is the claim that there are evaluative truths, there are true statements, propositions of the form X is good, X is bad, and so on. So this minimal realism is just going to be an unargued assumption of this talk. I think it's very plausible. I'm not going to give further arguments for it. But beyond this minimal form of realism, the value thesis is going to be neutral on a number of very important questions in value theory. So first of all, the value thesis is neutral on whether evaluative truths are strongly objective in the sense of being completely independent of anyone's attitudes. And in particular, most relevantly for our purposes, the value thesis is compatible with attitudinal theories of pleasantness and unpleasantness, and the badness and goodness associated with unpleasant and pleasant states. So let's just focus on unpleasantness for simplicity. So some philosophers think that what makes an experience unpleasant, like what makes a pain unpleasant when it is unpleasant, is the fact that we take a certain attitude towards that experience. Maybe we desire that it stop, or we dislike it, or something along those lines. Now, it's natural to think that what makes an experience unpleasant is in many cases going to be the same as what makes it bad. Like what makes a pain unpleasant is the same as what makes it bad. So if you had that kind of view, you would think that the badness of pain consists in the fact, or depends on the fact that we take a certain negative attitude towards pain. And so in that sense, a view along those lines would say that the badness of pain is in one sense not a purely objective fact, in the sense that it depends in a certain way on the attitudes we take. But that view is totally compatible with the value thesis, as I understand it. The value thesis is also compatible with the thesis of value experientialism. That's the claim that phenomenal states are the only things that are intrinsically good or bad. The value thesis is neutral on whether hedonism is true. That's the thesis that only pleasant and unpleasant experiences are intrinsically good or bad. It's neutral on whether any intrinsic value attaches to kind of being conscious as such. That is the maximally determinable phenomenal state of being conscious. Don't take a stand on that. And finally, the value thesis is neutral on whether any phenomenal states are unconditionally good or bad. So some philosophers have argued that pleasure is only good if the subject deserves it, or if the pleasure has an appropriately fitting object or something along those lines, or maybe pain is only bad if the subject doesn't deserve it. So on these sorts of views, there's some intuitive sense in which the goodness or badness of an experience depends on extrinsic conditions. But that's compatible with these experiences being good or bad, being intrinsically good or bad in the sense that I mean. So as I use the term, intrinsic value is just value that's not merely instrumental. It's kind of final or terminal value for its own sake. So an experience as having intrinsic value, in my sense, is compatible with that value depending on extrinsic conditions like desert or fittingness or whatever, so long as it's not a merely instrumental kind of value. Okay, with those clarifications out of the way, we can ask, why should we accept the value thesis? So first of all, I think the value thesis has just a huge amount of direct intuitive support. So intuitively, certain experiences like an ecstatic experience of aesthetic delight just seem intuitively to be very good. Some experiences, like a phenomenal state of excruciating pain, seem intuitively to be very bad. Indeed, I think phenomenal states like extreme pleasure and extreme pain are probably the intuitively clearest examples of intrinsically good or bad things. So I think there's a lot of just direct intuitive support for the value thesis. Value thesis can also be supported by considering thought experiments involving zombies and zombification. So Charles Stewart famously defended the claim that we value consciousness or certain forms of consciousness for their own sake in his book on the significance of consciousness. And he largely made use of thought experiments involving zombification. So you might imagine you have the opportunity to undergo a zombification procedure that will leave your behavior and functioning just as it is, but will entirely take away all your phenomenal consciousness. So most of us would opt not to undergo such a procedure. We might pay a huge amount of money to avoid undergoing such a procedure. It's natural to think that undergoing a procedure like that might be just about as bad as ordinary death, at least from a purely self-interested perspective. Now, Stewart uses these intuitions to support, largely to support the psychological claim that we in fact value consciousness or certain forms of consciousness for their own sake. But I think they can also be used to support the non-psychological, purely evaluative claim that certain forms of consciousness are intrinsically valuable, just because when we reflect on these scenarios, it just seems like if we were to lose out on phenomenal consciousness, we would be losing out on things of significant value, or in some cases, things of significant disvalue. So, I mean, there's more that could be said there, but I think most philosophers will be on board with the idea that there's a very strong, at least prima facie, intuitive case for the value thesis. So let's turn to the no value thesis. Remember, the no value thesis says this: the purely physical correlates of these phenomenal states, that is the phenomenal states made reference to in the value thesis, phenomenal states like an experience of ecstatic joy or excruciating pain, these physical correlates do not possess intrinsic value or disvalue, at least not to the same degree. So I don't want to quite commit to the claim that there's absolutely no intrinsic value or disvalue here. I mean, the physical states exhibit maybe aesthetically beautiful physical patterns that might have some non-zero value. The claim is just that they don't have anywhere near the kind of value that that intuitively the relevant phenomenal states seem to have. So the intuitive support for the no value thesis, I think comes largely from zombie thought experiments and other closely related thought experiments. So we might consider the zombie counterpart of a person experiencing ecstatic joy, and it just seems intuitively that there's nothing very good going on with the zombie, at least not anything nearly as good as what's going on with the conscious subject. Or we might imagine the zombie counterpart of someone who's in excruciating pain. And again, it just seems like there's nothing very bad going on with that zombie, at least not anything nearly as bad as what's going on with the conscious subject who's actually experiencing excruciating pain. Now, the key point is that when you imagine these zombie scenarios, at least when you imagine them in sufficient detail, kind of filling in all the relevant physical details, you imagine someone with all the actual physical correlates of ecstatic joy or excruciating pain. So you imagine someone with all the relevant neurobiological states and computational and physical functional states and so forth. And so the intuition that we have in considering these scenarios, that nothing of great value or disvalue is going on in these zombie scenarios, reflects the fact that these physical correlates considered in themselves, by themselves, they seem not to possess significant value or disvalue. They seem not to make any significant direct contribution to the goodness or badness of the situations that contain them. We can make similar points by considering a range of kind of scenarios involving detailed computer simulations that will instantiate the relevant functional or computational properties that are associated with consciousness in our brain. So suppose that I create a detailed simulation of a planet full of happy people. Or suppose I create a detailed computer simulation of a person being tortured, in each case detailed enough that we're kind of simulating the neuron-to-neuron interactions within the individual's brains. And suppose I run one of these simulations on my computer. We might ask, when I run the Happy Planet simulation, is there anything really good going on in my computer? Anything of significant value going on in my computer? Or when I run the torture simulation, is there anything of significant disvalue, anything very bad going on in my computer? And we might learn all the physical and computational facts about the processes in my computer, and we might still not know the answers to these evaluative questions. But I take it there's a strong intuition, even after we learn all the relevant physical and computational processes, that if those physical and computational processes are all that's going on and they're not accompanied by any experience, then there's nothing very bad going on in my computer when I run the torture simulation, or there's nothing very good going on in my computer when I run the Happy Planet simulation. But again, that's just to say that the relevant high-level functional computational states, when considered in themselves in accordance with their real computational functional nature, just seem intuitively to us to not carry significant value or disvalue. They seem intuitively to us not to make any direct significant contribution to the goodness or badness of the scenarios that include them. Now, I think that the intuitive support for the no value thesis that comes from these zombie and related thought experiments, it doesn't depend on the assumption that these scenarios are in any way metaphysically possible. That would obviously be a question-begging assumption in the current dialectical context, because the reductive materialist is going to deny the metaphysical possibility of these scenarios. All I am really assuming is that these are perfectly conceivable, conceptually coherent scenarios. So here's how I think we should think about these thought experiments. So let N be some relevant physical correlate of a phenomenal state like ecstatic joy. Okay, so we consider a scenario involving a zombie counterpart of someone in ecstatic joy, and we intuitively judge there's nothing of significant value going on in this scenario. So this intuitive judgment that there's nothing of significant value in this zombie scenario reflects a possibly implicit intuitive judgment that instances of N in themselves fail to make a significant contribution to the overall goodness of this scenario, which is to say, it reflects an implicit intuitive judgment that instances of N are not intrinsically valuable to any significant degree. That's kind of the key intuition that supports the no value thesis. And that intuition is there completely independently of questions of whether these scenarios are metaphysically possible. So some philosophers, I think, will resist this line of argument that I've been giving for the no value thesis by saying something along the following lines. Might say, well, look, zombies at least have cognitive states like desires and likes and dislikes, and it's natural to think that there's significant value or disvalue to having these relevant cognitive states satisfied or frustrated. So there's significant value to having like desires satisfied, significant disvalue to having desires frustrated. So in response, I have a few things to say about this line of objection. So first of all, it's not at all clear to me that zombies, in fact, do have desires or any of these other relevant cognitive states, at least given our ordinary concept of desire and like and dislike and so on. Now, ultimately, I think it's partly a verbal question whether zombies really have desires. So, I mean, certainly we can cook up a purely functional concept of desire, and maybe we already have some kind of purely functional concept of desire. But I think it's clear that we also have a concept of desire that's kind of phenomenally loaded, that as a conceptual matter involves phenomenology. I don't want to say too much about what exactly is the nature of this concept. So one view would be that that as a conceptual matter, desire involves necessarily cognitive phenomenology. Another view is that it's a kind of functional state where part of the functional role is maybe non-cognitive sensory phenomenology or some other kind of phenomenology. But I do think it's clear that we have some ordinary concept of desire that's phenomenology involving. And once we see that there's that we can distinguish these two concepts of desire, a purely functional one and a phenomenology involving one, the question arises, like, which concept of desire is the normatively significant one? At least if you think that desire, satisfaction, and frustration are normatively significant things. And here I think that I'd kind of want to turn this objection around. The fact that we have such a clear intuitive reaction to these zombie scenarios, to the effect that there's nothing of great value or disvalue going on in them, suggests that the normatively significant concept of desire is the phenomenology involving one. And here I think that this is actually, as something of an aside, this is relevant to how we should think about attitudinal theories of pleasantness and unpleasantness of the sort that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So again, let's just focus on unpleasantness for simplicity. So again, the attitudinal theory says that what makes pain bad, or what makes pain unpleasant, and plausibly also what makes it bad, is the fact that we take a certain attitude towards it. And we can ask, what kind of attitude are we talking about, or what's the relevant concept of the attitude? Is it a purely functional concept, or is it a phenomenology involving concept? And here I think that the thing to say is, if these attitudinal theories are correct, then the most plausible thing to say is that the relevant attitude is itself essentially a phenomenology involving attitude, something that makes a direct contribution to total phenomenology. And I think this is just independently well supported by considering certain thought experiments, just because it seems like the badness and the unpleasantness of pain doesn't even seem to be conceivably separable from a subject's total phenomenology, in the way that it would be if the relevant attitude were construed along purely functionalist lines. So consider someone being tortured, in excruciating pain over the course of, say, an hour. Okay, so they're having an experience that's unpleasant and very bad. It doesn't even seem conceivable that you could have someone with the same total phenomenology as the torture victim, but who's not having an experience that's unpleasant and bad. And that suggests that if we want to say that what makes for unpleasantness is a certain cognitive attitude, then we ought to say that that attitude itself essentially makes a contribution to total phenomenology. So we're making use of an attitude that's essentially phenomenology involving. Okay. Now, I've got this argument against reductive materialism. It's got two premises. I've suggested that each of the premises has a significant amount of intuitive support. But of course, if you're a reductive materialist and you want to hold on to reductive materialism, it's of course possible to just reject one of the premises and bite some bullets. I sort of think that if you want to hold on to reductive materialism, the most plausible way to go is to reject the no value thesis, just because the value thesis seems, that just seems to me much more costly to reject. So suppose that's right. Suppose that to save reductive materialism, we're going to have to reject the no value thesis. So the first thing to say about that is that just needs to be of course, that is an option for the reductive materialism, but that just needs to be recognized as a further and I think significant cost to reductive materialism. And it's a cost that goes beyond the usual costs that I think are kind of standardly priced into commitment to reductive materialism. So it's well known that reductive materialists need to reject certain other intuitions, like distinctness intuitions, like that pain is distinct from firing C fibers, or modal separability intuitions, like that it's possible to have C fiber firing without pain, and so on. So the first point to make here about this response is just that there's also the need for the reductive materialist to reject the intuitions in support of the no value thesis, and that just needs to be recognized as a further and I think substantial cost to the reductive materialist view. The second and somewhat more subtle point that I want to make about this option of responding to the argument by rejecting the no value thesis is that rejecting the no value thesis for the reductive materialist is actually, I think, a more costly option than it might at first appear. It commits the reductive materialist to a package of views that's, I think, implausible and kind of bizarre and uncomfortable. And that's because if you're a reductive materialist and you want to reject the no value thesis, that's going to lead you to a doctrine that I call internal privilege. And I'm going to argue in the remainder of the talk that that the combination of reductive materialism with internal privilege is an awkward and I think implausible combination of views. It's an uneasy combination. Okay, so what does internal privilege say? So internal privilege is the claim that when assessing the value of phenomenal states, the internal perspective is strongly epistemically privileged over the external perspective. So here the external perspective is the perspective by which we grasp the relevant states, as it were, from the third personal perspective under physical or scientific concepts. The internal perspective is the perspective from which we apprehend the relevant states kind of from the inside under first personal, perhaps phenomenal concepts. So internal privilege, in other words, says that the way things seem from the internal perspective, as it were from the inside, constitutes a more or less correct apprehension of the value of phenomenal states. Because again, the way things seem from the internal perspective is that these phenomenal states have significant value and disvalue. We're imagining someone who wants to accept the value thesis, so they accept that claim. By contrast, the way things seem from the external perspective is systematically misleading with respect to the value of these states. Again, I've argued in support of the no value thesis that from the external perspective, the relevant physical states considered in terms of their physical nature from the third person perspective seem to us not to have significant value. So we're imagining someone who rejects the no value thesis, so they think that the way things seem value-wise from the external perspective is systematically misleading with respect to the real value of these states. So again, I want to argue that the combination of reductive materialism with the doctrine of internal privilege is an awkward, bizarre, and implausible combination of views. Maybe a good way to start to see this is to appreciate how internal privilege is actually a very natural and plausible position for someone like the Russellian identity theorist to take. So for the Russellian identity theorist, we don't adequately grasp the nature of experience when experience is considered from the outside, from a third person external perspective under scientific concepts. So by contrast, we get a better grasp of the nature of experience when we consider it from the internal perspective. So if that's your view, then it's no surprise that the internal perspective would be epistemically privileged when it comes to assessing how valuable or disvaluable these states are. But of course, if you're a reductive materialist, you don't think that. If you're a reductive materialist, you think that really it's the external perspective that affords the most clear and perspicuous grasp of the real nature of these states, what it really is to have these states. And if you think that, then it's bizarre to think that it's the external perspective that's systematically misleading about the value these states really have. And conversely, it's bizarre to think that the internal perspective, which for the reductive materialist is giving us a kind of confused or misleading or obscure grasp of the nature of these states, that perspective would be the one that's epistemically privileged when it comes to assessing the real value of these states. We can ask, like, why should metaphysical obscurity bring normative clarity? Of course, metaphysical obscurity for the reductive materialist comes from the internal perspective. And conversely, why should metaphysical clarity bring normative obscurity? Again, metaphysical clarity for the reductive materialist comes from conceiving of these states from the external perspective. I should say that this point that I'm making here is somewhat indebted to some related remarks from Jeff Lee on a slightly different issue. So Jeff Lee argues that when it comes to assessing the natural significance of consciousness, we should favor the way things seem from the external perspective over the way things seem from the internal perspective. So here, the natural significance of consciousness is the question of roughly how deep of a joint in nature does consciousness carve? Is the difference between being conscious and being non-conscious a deep or a shallow joint in nature? And Lee argues that if you take the reductive materialist perspective, even though we're intuitively inclined to think that the conscious-non-conscious divide is a deep joint carving divide, Lee argues that no, we should assess this question from the external perspective. And if you take the external perspective, it seems to us that the distinction between the conscious and the non-conscious is not like really deep, and so, or at least not in comparison with some other things. And so that's the view that we should take if we're reductive materialists. So I'm basically making the argument that Lee makes, but about assessing the value of conscious states rather than the natural significance of consciousness. Just to kind of bring out the oddity of combining reductive materialism with internal privilege, we might consider a range of analogies. So suppose you want to know whether democracy is valuable in itself apart from its instrumental benefits. It's very plausible that the ideal epistemic perspective from which to answer this question is one that employs a clear and perspicuous understanding of what it is for a system to be democratic. It would be bizarre to suggest that the ideal epistemic perspective from which to assess the value of democracy is one that employs an obscure or confused or misleading conception of what it is for a system to be democratic. Or to bring in a theme from Derek Parfit's writings on personal identity, suppose you want to know whether identity is what matters in survival. So Parfit argues, I think convincingly, that if you want to know whether identity is what matters, it helps to have a clear understanding of what personal identity over time consists in, that is, the nature of personal identity over time. Now, if it turns out that identity over time is like a further fact, then maybe there's some plausibility to the idea that identity is the thing that matters. But conversely, if it turns out that identity over time is not a further fact, and it's just a matter of having like R relations that don't branch and don't fuse, then it becomes more plausible that, well, maybe it's not quite identity that's the thing that matters, rather it's the R relation that matters. But the key point here is that in assessing the value of personal identity, it's very plausible that it helps to take a perspective that employs a clear and perspicuous understanding of the nature of personal identity over time. There's another way, a related way in which we can kind of bring out the oddness of combining reductive materialism with internal privilege, and that's to consider a range of kind of hypothetical, structurally similar challenges to reductive materialism, and think about how it might be plausible to respond to these. So backing up a little bit, the argument I presented gives us a situation with something like the following structure. So from the internal perspective, we've got an experience E, and it seems to have a certain feature F. In this case, F is intrinsic value or disvalue. And then from the external perspective, the physical correlate of E, call it N, appears not to have this feature. It appears not to be, in our case, significantly intrinsically valuable or disvaluable. And if you have a situation with this structure, there's three possible responses you could give. So first of all, you could deny identity. You could say that E is not identical to N. That way we would respect both the internal appearances and the external appearances. That would be my preferred response in the case at hand. Second, we could reject internal appearances. We could say that E does not really have F, contrary to the way things seem from the internal perspective. That would be sort of like denying the value thesis. You would say, well, from the internal perspective, maybe pain seems to be bad, but really it's not. So we'd reject the value thesis. Or third, we could reject external appearances. We could say that N, in fact, has F, contrary to the way things seem from the external perspective. So denying the no value thesis is a type 3 response. It's a reject external appearances response. But I want to argue that we should be a little bit uncomfortable with this response, because if we consider a range of structurally similar hypothetical challenges to reductive materialism, it looks like the reject external appearances response looks really implausible, at least if we take on board the reductive materialist assumption that it's the external perspective that affords the most clear and perspicuous grasp of the nature of these states. So let's consider this example. Suppose that from the internal perspective, we've got a set of experiences, like color experiences, say, that seem from the internal perspective to have a certain resemblance structure. And then suppose we identify some relevant physical correlates of these experiences, and we consider those physical correlates from the external perspective. And from that perspective, they seem not to have that resemblance structure. So here the response of rejecting external appearances would say, even though these physical states seem from the external perspective not to have the relevant resemblance structure, nonetheless, they do have that resemblance structure, but that's a fact we can only apprehend kind of from the inside, from the internal perspective. Now that seems to me to be a very implausible thing to say, at least if you think like the reductive materialist, that it's the external perspective that gives you the most clear and perspicuous understanding of the real nature of these states. By contrast, like if you're some kind of Russellian identity theorist, this response doesn't seem so implausible. After all, a certain kind of Russellian identity theorist will say that it's the internal perspective that gives you a privileged grasp of the kind of inner nature of these states. So on that sort of view, it would be no surprise if that were a kind of epistemically privileged perspective from which to assess the kind of real resemblance facts. But if you're a reductive materialist and you reject that sort of picture, the response of rejecting external appearances here seems really implausible. Or consider a second analogous example. Suppose that from the internal perspective, pain seems to cause avoidance behavior. But suppose we then do some science. We identify a physical correlate of pain. And from this perspective, it seems that the relevant physical correlate just doesn't cause avoidance behavior. Here, the response of rejecting external appearances would be to say that even though this physical state seems from the external perspective not to cause avoidance behavior, nonetheless, it really does cause avoidance behavior. It's just that that fact can only be apprehended from the internal perspective. Again, that just seems like a really implausible thing to say. Or consider a third example, this one inspired by some work from Adam Pautz. So Pautz argues, to put things in my terminology, that from the internal perspective, if we take an experience, say, as of a red square, Pautz thinks that, introspectively, a red square experience seems to essentially involve squareness or some kind of relation to squareness. So if you were to kind of specify the real definition or essence of this phenomenal property, you would have to make reference to squareness. He thinks that that's a plausible kind of introspective claim. On the other hand, he argues that if you take the narrow neurobiological correlate of the red square experience, this, from the external perspective anyway, doesn't seem to essentially involve squareness or any kind of relation to squareness. It seems like you could fully specify what it is to have the relevant neurobiological state without mentioning squareness or any kind of relation to squareness. And so for this reason, Pautz thinks that we should deny the identity of the red square phenomenal property with the relevant narrow neurobiological correlate. Here, the response of rejecting external appearances would be to say that even though the relevant neurobiological state seems from the external perspective not to essentially involve squareness or any kind of relation to squareness, nonetheless, it does essentially involve squareness. It's just that we can only kind of get at this fact from the internal perspective. Once again, that strikes me as a very implausible thing to say, at least if you think, like the reductive materialist, that it's the external perspective that's giving you the most clear and perspicuous understanding of the real nature of these states. One final example, and then I'll conclude. Suppose that from the internal perspective, an experience of a blue expanse, for example, seems to have certain structural features like being smooth and continuous. And then suppose, and I'm not saying that this is actually what we've discovered. Some have argued that this is what we've actually discovered. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, suppose hypothetically that from the external perspective, we identify some relevant neural correlate of this experience. And from the external perspective, that neural correlate seems to lack those structural features. Here, again, the response of denying external appearances, rejecting external appearances, would be to say that, well, the relevant physical state, in fact, does have these structural features of being smooth and continuous. It's despite the fact that from the external perspective, it seems not to. It's just that we can only kind of apprehend these structural features from the internal perspective. Again, that seems to me to be a very implausible thing to say if, like the reductive materialist, you think it's the external perspective that's giving you the clearest understanding of the real nature of these states. Okay, so of course, even if I'm right that the response of rejecting external appearances is really implausible in these other cases, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's implausible as a response to the axiological argument. That is, it doesn't necessarily follow that just denying the no value thesis is implausible as a response to the axiological argument. But I think it should make the reductive materialist at least a little bit uncomfortable. And it poses, I think, at least a significant challenge. If you want to save reductive materialism by rejecting the no value thesis and the associated intuitions, you owe us an explanation of why this case is relevantly different from the 4 analogous cases I just mentioned. Okay, so just to wrap up, I've put forward an axiological argument against reductive materialism, an argument that relies on intuitions to the effect that certain phenomenal states differ from their physical correlates with respect to their intrinsic value, and therefore by Leibniz's law are not identical. The argument was put forward with 2 premises, the value thesis and the no value thesis. I've argued that each of these premises has a great deal of intuitive support, and I've made a few further claims. So first, if reductive materialists must deny the no value thesis to save reductive materialism, which might be the most plausible way to go if you insist on reductive materialism, this just needs to be kind of priced in as a further significant cost to reductive materialism. And secondly, these costs are greater than they might at first appear. That's because denying the no value thesis leads to the doctrine of internal privilege. And as I've argued, the combination of reductive materialism with internal privilege is an awkward and I think unattractive and implausible combination of views. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. What a great talk. Cheers. Okay, so as usual, could you please put your names in the chat, or just the word question, or just like I've done, the word A, or in my case A for Alex. Cool. Excellent. So Brian, thanks very much. That was a really cool talk. Damien, you are to kick us off.
Hi, thanks, Brian. That was really interesting. I think you have convinced me about the value of states like extreme pains or extreme joys, but I was just wondering what's your view on everything in between?
Yeah.
So states like just colors or sounds or tickles, what's their value? Or does your argument only involve the extreme states, but not all the phenomenal states?
Good, great question. So I wanted to be officially neutral for the purposes of the talk on the value of those kind of like hedonically neutral states, and that's just because I think the clearest examples of intrinsically good or bad phenomenal states are the hedonically loaded ones, the non-neutral states, especially when we consider kind of the affective extremes. But I guess my own personal view is that there's value even to like non-affective states. So David Chalmers has been giving this talk on sentience and moral status a number of venues recently, where he talks about Vulcans, which are creatures that are kind of have the full range of phenomenal consciousness we do, except no affective states. So no like positive or negatively valent states. And I mean, I think the main point he wants to make is that these things have moral status. But he and I also would say that, yeah, the lives of Vulcans can be valuable. Like if I were a Vulcan, I think I would rationally prefer to stay in existence. Actually, I think that the life of a Vulcan could have an extreme amount of value. Like if you think about I guess, like especially like, a Vulcan can have like sophisticated forms of cognitive phenomenology, can engage in all sorts of sophisticated reasoning, come to all sorts of conclusions. And that seems to me to be significantly valuable. But even when it comes to the like more basic kind of like sensory stage, like experience of color, I guess I'm inclined to think that there's some value to that as well, though I didn't want to rest on that assumption for the purposes of my argument.
Okay, thank you.
Is that the exchange done? Yeah. Great.
Oh, I mean, I have another question, but I can come back later because I see there are many people.
If it's quick, you can follow up.
I can follow up.
Yeah.
Sorry?
If it's quick, yeah, go ahead.
And I just wanted to ask Grant, and why do you think that is only in some cases we can clearly see the value of the phenomenal state? Does this have any implication for so-called revelation style argument, like phenomenal transparency, for example?
Oh, good question. So, I mean, so one immediate thought I have is like, maybe it's much easier to see the value of extreme pleasure than it is to intellectually see the value of like an experience of red, just because an experience of red has much less value than extreme pleasure. And in general, when we're dealing with quantities of value very close to zero, it might be kind of hard to be sure that we've got something of non-zero value or just a little bit above zero value. So that might be part of the explanation. I mean, as for phenomenal revelation theses, I don't really have a view as to whether revelation is true. I'm definitely sympathetic to like a partial revelation thesis about phenomenal properties that kind of like ideal a priori reflection on phenomenal properties can reveal some like many significant truths about the nature of phenomenal properties. I'm much less confident about a full revelation thesis that ideal a priori reflection can reveal all truths about the nature or essence of phenomenal properties. So I think, you know, if I go in for a merely partial revelation thesis, then that could explain why in some cases we can't know or can't know with great confidence that a given state has a certain evaluative feature. Another thing to say, if you did accept a full revelation thesis, would be, okay, I mean the proper formulation of a full revelation thesis should be something like, ideal a priori reflection will reveal all facts about the nature of any given phenomenal property, but our a priori reflection is very far from ideal, and so the fact that we are rationally non-ideal might explain why we are highly uncertain about the value of certain phenomenal states.
Yes, I see. Thanks.
Okay, great. I can't tell if I'm muted or not. No, I'm good. Okay, right. Apparently I'm next. Okay, cool. Brian, I have a few things, but some are quick. So very briefly, when you introduce the notion of the axiological and of, in some sense, consciousness being connected up with axiological matters, you talk about intrinsic value.
Mhm.
And just small point, as you probably know, like intrinsic and extrinsic value, both are axiological matters. And it's just not clear to me why you really needed to make that distinction and why you couldn't just focus on value properties, and why you're complicating it by separating out intrinsic and extrinsic value.
Good. So the reason for focusing on an intrinsic value is that the no value thesis is going to be really implausible if we just talk about value without the qualification of intrinsic. Because I definitely want to say that, you know, the relevant brain state associated with pain is instrumentally disvaluable. I mean, I'm sympathetic to a kind of dualism where there's something like a causal relationship between the relevant brain state and the relevant phenomenal state. So yeah, I mean, I want to say that these states have instrumental value and disvalue. I mean, so yeah.
That's more axiological. So all I'm saying is I anticipated you going there. One has to be careful when you introduce the idea that consciousness has value. That's not yet to say that it has intrinsic value, and so some work needs to be done if you're later relying on a specific intrinsic value thesis. That's not going to follow merely from the idea that it has axiological connections as such. So
yeah,
obviously this is a talk, not a paper, but in the paper you're going to want to be careful to make sure that just because you've said it's got value doesn't follow yet that the value is intrinsic. That's all.
Yeah.
That was my one minor point, but that's fine. I don't think you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's right. I think the way I define axiological significance is just the claim that that phenomenal states have intrinsic value.
Kind of a funky use of
axiological,
I guess I want to say.
What's that?
It's kind of a funky use of the term axiological, I suppose. Like the axiology is value theory, and value theory is the theory of value, and value can be intrinsic or extrinsic. And indeed, sometimes something can be both intrinsically and extrinsically valuable at once?
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, I definitely want to agree that phenomenal
We're
states
not disagreeing.
can be instrumental. Yeah.
It's a matter of like formulation when you write up the paper kind of thing.
Yeah, that's fair.
The other thing was just this tiny bit of, I think, and this is something that like Adam and I like, as I assume you'll agree, this has an Adam Patsy flavor to it, this argument of yours. Like you take some alleged facts about consciousness, and you claim consciousness has those properties, but the correlates lack them, and so reduction's in trouble. All right. And the claim, and so I always end up thinking like, okay, but what about, hang on, look, suppose I reason, look, until I think about Clark Kent as Superman, the idea that he's strong looks ridiculous. So likewise, you might think the idea that Superman is strong, that looks great. The idea that Clark Kent is strong, that looks stupid, while I don't know they're identical.
Yep.
But once I learn they're identical, the idea that Clark Kent is strong no longer looks stupid. So in the same way, you might think the value intuition that consciousness has value, that looks great. And before I know, so to speak, that if it's noble, suppose that before I know that consciousness is identical to certain neural stuff, the idea that the neural stuff has value, that looks like a terrible thesis. But you might think once I've learned this sort of a posteriori identity, then the idea that this anti-value intuition, that the physical property lacks the relevant intrinsic value, it loses its plausibility in the way that Clark Kent is strong loses its plausibility. So the thought is like, in order for the intuition that the physical lacks the relevant value to have any plausibility, you need to presuppose your conclusion.
Good. So I don't think that's quite the epistemic situation we're in. I mean, otherwise, like all Leibniz's law arguments in any domain would be like question begging.
Well, not always. If you had independent reason for thinking that, regardless of, so I see what you mean. So you might think, say, like I say to you, statue and lump differ in properties, and you say, nah, once you realize they're identical, then I understand. But sorry.
But here I think we do have the relevant independent reason, though it's not necessarily like infallible. So I mean, the Clark Superman case, I mean, here we already know that the identity is there, and if we could somehow conclusively establish the identity, then we would need to either say that Superman's not strong or that Clark is strong, and we need to figure out how to retain Leibniz's law in the face of this identity. But when it's an open question whether the identity is there, and we have independent reason to think that A has property F and B lacks property F, then I think in many cases the most justified conclusion is that there's not an identity. So suppose we're not sure about the identity of Superman, and we find there's this guy Jim, and we've seen him working out, and he can only bench like 40 pounds, and it's just like we've got tons of evidence that he's just not very strong. Now, of course, all this evidence might be misleading. He might be putting on an act, but all of this is like independent evidence that he's not very strong. Maybe we've observed him in a range of cases. Then I take it that is some evidence that Jim is not Superman.
I agree.
It's not conclusive evidence, but it is some evidence. So here I think I'm assuming that the relevant intuitions have some epistemic value. They can provide prima facie support. And so like the fact that there's that careful reflection on these zombie scenarios supports the no value thesis, that provides some reason to say that the relevant physical states have lack value. So, and I think that's like independent, like that intuitive support is not presupposing the non-identity. Of course, you might come along and give a conclusive argument for reductive materialism, in which case I'm going to have to make some adjustments. That's just kind of how it goes.
Yeah, sure. That's great. So basically, you need, as it were, it connects a bit to how Mike was pressing me on some stuff I was talking about a few weeks ago. You need to claim there's a class of like conscious properties, and we have a grasp on those, and we grasp that part of their nature involves value in a certain way. But we also have a grasp on the physical, and it's not like the physical is understood merely negatively as the non-mental, but we have a positive grasp on it such that we know that the members of that domain, the properties in that set, intuitively lack certain features, namely value. So reflection on the physical properties as we know them, as they're described to us, suggests strongly that they're a bit like weak Clark Kent, as it were.
Yeah.
I think you need to be explicit about that, as opposed to merely saying, well, I'm not going to say much about the physical, but whatever it is, probably it doesn't have much value. Not that you said that, but I guess what this discussion brings out is one has to be clear that you're making positive claims about the nature of negative claims about the nature of the physical properties, namely that they lack value. Yeah, cool. Okay, good. That works. Yeah. That's the way out of my otherwise you're in a circle argument. Right, cool. Final brief comment. When you said non-reductive physicalism, you connected it up with primitivism. And you said that would be the most plausible way to go. So just briefly, just a little slightly self-indulgent, but not just me, but like Shamik Dasgupta, Gideon Rosen in unpublished work, Johnson Schaffer, Ralph Bader, we all kind of think that physicalism of the non-reductive kind should be understood as a kind of grounding thesis, a lot like in your sensible quality Russellian monism, but minus the Russellian monism.
Yeah.
And there's no primitivism. Primitivism is sort of an unfair label to that view, because we see the mental as fully grounded in the physical. I know you have kind of cool arguments for why that couldn't be, but I just wonder why, one, dialectically, do you need to say that in this paper? Like, do you need to like throw us overboard, as it were, in this paper? And two, why do you think we're so easily dismissed, as it were?
So I guess I was thinking that something like the Jonathan Schaffer view, which I think is what you have in mind, where phenomenal properties aren't identical to physical properties but are fully grounded in them. That I would count that as a version of primitivism in my sense. So primitivism is not meant to be a denial of a full grounding claim. It's Schaffer would accept the phenomenal states are fully grounded in the physical. It's meant to be a denial of a like reductive definition claim. So, I mean, basically, like to say that phenomenal properties are primitive is to just say that you can't give a real definition of them in purely physical terms. You can't say that to have such and such experiences, to have such and such physical state in a reductive way. So I was meaning, I mean, maybe primitivism might suggest really loaded and kind of dualisty, and I guess I think that Schaffer's view is a kind of like semi-dualism. Of course, he doesn't accept that there's a modal independence. I guess you, with your contingent grounding laws, would even accept a modal independence of the physical and the phenomenal. So take someone like Adam Pautz. So Pautz is, I would think of him as, in his view, is in the spirit of dualism. He would sometimes characterize his view in those along those lines, but he's open to the view that phenomenal states are grounded by kind of primitive grounding laws in physical states. So I didn't mean primitivism to be incompatible with the thesis of full grounding. The reason I said primitivism instead of dualism is that I wanted it to be compatible with a kind of full grounding, full metaphysical supervenience of the phenomenal and the physical.
I'm smiling here because we had this debate last week with my talk about whether you get dualism from this kind of view or not. And I mean, there's tricky questions as to whether you could have full grounding of the mental and the physical Schaffer style and still get real definitions. And Rosen would say yes, but we can talk about this later, and I'll shut up now. But
yeah, that's because Rosen. No, sorry, go.
No, I was saying you respond, but I'll be quiet now.
Oh yeah, I think Rosen's a kind of trickier case because he thinks that you can give a real definition. You can, there can be a true real definition to be F is to be G, even though the being F is not identical to being G.
Yeah, I happen to agree. So yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to wade into that issue.
Yeah, no.
I tend to want to say that real definitions go with identities, but yeah, that's a kind of big metaphysics.
Maybe like safer territory is to call, like, follow Keith Allen and call the view, like, I don't know, call it naive, like, I don't know, naive realism rather than primitivism if it's the colors or something. I don't know. Primitivism carries like baggage you don't necessarily want, given you don't want to rile opponents up for no reason.
Yeah, I don't even need to give it a name. It only came up once in the talk. I could just say the like non-reductive view or something like that. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for the cool paper. So next is not me, but is Simone. Come stai?
Bene, grazie. I'm fine, thanks. Thank you, Brian. It was a very interesting talk. I wish to understand, I have a point of clarification perhaps, but you said that the external perspective systematically misleads on the values or something like that. At the same time, you have the no value thesis saying that the physical correlates of the phenomenal states do not have any value. Now I'm wondering how can we understand the notion of correlate? I mean, if something that gives us the external perspective, I mean, physical states are those on which we mount our external perspective, they do systematically mislead about the value. Then on what basis can we say that this physical state is a correlate of this phenomenal state? I mean, because the notion of correlation is a notion in which you have the two co-occurrence of two states or something, right?
So let me see if I understand. So I was assuming that the notion of correlation is neutral on whether there's two things or one thing. So trivially, everything is correlated with itself. And so in claiming that pain correlates with a phenomenal state, I didn't mean that claim to rule out the idea that pain is that physical state. One reason why they might correlate, reductive materialists might even say, like, one very plausible explanation for why there's this robust correlation is that they're identical. But it's also compatible with saying that they're distinct. So I wanted correlation here to just be neutral on the key metaphysical question.
Yeah.
But then one further point about the idea that the external perspective is systematically misleading with respect to the value of these states. Yeah. So that wasn't my claim. I don't think that the external perspective is systematically misleading with respect to the value of the relevant physical states. My claim was just, if you are a reductive materialist and you want to respond to my argument by denying the no value thesis, then you are led into the claim that the external perspective is systematically misleading with respect to the value of the relevant physical states. And the point that I wanted to make is that's kind of an odd thing for the reductive materialists to think, given that they think it's the external perspective that gives the most clear and perspicuous grasp of the nature of these states.
But the systematical misleading, you're saying that the systematical misleading is due to the fact that you cannot grasp the value that is within the phenomenal state, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but I mean, if I go for the reductive materialism, which says that identities have the very specific kind of correlation, the strongest one, perhaps, why should I be forced in saying that it's misleading and it's systematic misleading? Which we know, being misleading is just something that does not, one state does not accompany the other or doesn't point to the proper one. But the systematical misleading means that there is some sort of stable relation that in virtue of being such relation, then that the relation doesn't point to the proper relata because it's systematic. So it's stronger.
Well, right. So So I was thinking, think of the intuitions that I was going through when defending the no value thesis. We consider these zombie scenarios and we consider them in detail. And when we do that, we kind of imagine all the relevant physical correlates of excruciating pain. And I was assuming it seems intuitively to us as though nothing very bad is going on. Now, suppose you think that intuition is wrong, then you think at least that intuition is misleading. You think that when we consider these scenarios and we think, these physical states by themselves are not very bad, that intuition is wrong. So intuition is misleading there. But then what makes it systematic, I think, is you don't like if you want to be a reductive materialist who denies the no value thesis, you're not just denying this one intuition about the lack of value of this physical correlate of excruciating pain. You're also going to say the same thing about the lack of value of the physical correlate of pleasure, or any other relevant phenomenal states that we think of as good. So in a systematic way, like all of these physical states considered in themselves in terms of their real physical nature seem to us not to possess significant value. So if you say that all those intuitions are wrong, then that would be to say that these intuitions are systematically misleading.
So the misleading cuts across the different states. I mean, it's a general kind of misleading.
Yeah, about physical states considered as physical.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the exchange done. Good. But next up we have Barbara, please.
I think Maya has a finger.
I didn't see. Sorry, Maya. Please.
Yeah, I mean, actually, my question was just a follow-up, so maybe I can just follow up now and take myself off the list.
Yeah, cool. Go.
Yeah, because I mean, I was also somewhat, so I see the dilemma for the reductive materialist who wants to deny no value because it seems like they're being a bit inconsistent about when they are or aren't accepting, I guess you could say, what you call the internal perspective on sort of our mental states. But I guess, like Simone, I was kind of a bit puzzled about why this commits them to the thesis to sort of diagnose the internal or the external perspective wholesale, because you might think that if you're a reductive materialist who wants to deny no value, what you're going to want to do is to provide a more fine-grained account of when our axiological intuitions are misleading and when they're not. I mean, I'm just kind of throwing things out here because it would take more time to really think up a good account. But you might say that maybe one account is to say, well, perhaps we're good at detecting the presence of value, but we're not good at detecting its absence. Then you would have a story to tell about why we can reliably detect the value of our conscious states, but also that kind of general account about when axiological sort of intuitions about axiological properties are reliable still lets you be consistent about saying, well, but we just got it wrong about the lack of value in physical states. And so that's, I mean, I'm not sure if that particular account would work or not, but that's just to say, it seems like the real place for the reductive materialist to go is just to say, well, I don't have to be quite so, I guess you could say, coarse-grained, or to think about internal versus external as really the relevant division for explaining which intuitions I accept and which ones I don't.
Yeah, really interesting. So let me just try to think through what this response would come to in detail. So is the thought that, so I'm assuming that the relevant position is something like this. We accept that like pleasure is good because that's the way it seems from the internal perspective, and we accept that pain is bad because that's the way it seems from the internal perspective. And is the thought that, well, maybe the internal perspective is really good at identifying the presence of value, but maybe not identifying the absence of value, whereas maybe the external perspective is better at identifying the absence of value, but not the presence of value? Is that the thought?
I wouldn't even go so far as to say anything about the external perspective being bad about identify. I mean, I don't think you even have to go there. I think you could just stop with what you said about the internal perspective, and that might get you enough.
Well, but so if you I see. So the thought is maybe the internal perspective is good in some ways, bad in other ways, in that in which case there wouldn't be the basis for a clear-cut comparative claim that the internal perspective is epistemically privileged over the external. Like it's privileged on some questions, but not in others.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I mean, I guess you could say, just to kind of deny the perspicuity of internal versus external being the categories that you're using to explain when our intuitions about mental states are reliable or not.
Yeah. Good. So yeah, I think this is an interesting and potentially promising line of response. I want to think further about it. I think to make it really work, we would need to identify a significant range of cases where the internal perspective is getting things wrong, where and ideally on where the external perspective isn't getting things wrong in the same cases, so that you could argue that that it's not in a kind of across the board epistemic advantage from the internal perspective. It's not immediately obvious to me that there are going to be a range of cases where the internal perspective is getting things wrong. I mean, you know, there are cases where the internal perspective maybe claims to find the absence of value or not much value, but you know, maybe like a sensory experience of gray or something, we find not to be significantly valuable or disvaluable. If you could make the case that, you know, despite internal appearances, it really is super valuable, then that would be a case where the internal perspective is getting things wrong. But I would want to see a motivation for that. And yeah, in more general, I'd want to see a motivation for the claim that there maybe are a wide class of cases where the internal perspective is getting things wrong. If that case could be made, then I think the reductive materialist wouldn't need to accept a kind of across the board epistemic advantage for the internal perspective, and that would make things a bit more comfortable for the reductive materialist. But yeah, I would need to see that case made.
Great. Is that the exchange done? Great, cool. Barbara.
Hi, thank you for that very interesting talk. Well, this can be sort of seen as a follow-up too. So I am wondering about this claim that pain is intrinsically bad. So, I mean, somehow intuitively, I'm going to say, yeah, there's something about it. Or, well, from the first person perspective, though, am I somehow in touch with its badness or just with the I don't like it? So, okay, so you addressed this maybe it's like we have this attitude towards our pain. And you said, okay, well, my view is compatible with that as long as that's not the only thing. Is that right? That's making pain bad. As long as it's not the case that the only thing, the reason that pain is, it's instrumentally bad because we don't like it. And maybe some other things people might want to say, because it interferes with us achieving our life goals, we can't do things, we can't, you know, so there's maybe a number of instrumental reasons why pain is bad. But you want to say it's not just instrumental, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I want to say that the badness of pain is not just instrumental, so it's not just that it like distracts us from other things or whatever.
Yeah.
But I do want my view to be compatible with the claim that its intrinsic badness might be fully due to the fact that we take a certain attitude towards it. That I want to at least be open to.
Okay, I'm not sure if I understand that. I
want to be open to the view that the intrinsic badness of pain is wholly grounded in the fact that the subject herself takes a certain attitude towards it. I don't really want to be open to a more wild form of relativism where, like, if our community thinks that the pain of a certain group isn't bad, then it makes it not bad. Like I think no, like maybe each person's pain is bad because they themselves take a certain attitude towards it. But it's a kind of like, beyond that, it's an objective fact that if someone takes the relevant attitude towards their pain, then it's bad. That's the sort of view I at least want to be open to.
Okay, so it's not sounding such like intrinsic badness to me, I guess. So if feeling was pleasure and someone had the that same attitude towards it, then the pleasure would be bad?
Yeah, I mean, so usually on these attitudinal theories, just as a kind of verbal conceptual matter, you wouldn't count it as pleasure if you took the negative attitude towards it. So these views say, like, you know, what makes a state pleasant is you take like a positive attitude, whether you like it or you want it to continue. What makes an experience unpleasant is you take a negative attitude towards it, you dislike it or you want it to cease or something like that. But it might be that, like, what makes the experience deserve the name pleasure is the fact that we take this pleasantness making attitude towards it. And conversely, maybe what makes what makes it the case that the experience deserves the name pain is that we take the relevant negative attitude towards it. In the pain case, maybe that's a little bit trickier because of pain asymbolia.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say something about that on your side, actually, to give you a response to those who would object to your view because of pain asymbolia. I don't know if you've looked into that literature, but you can't help but finding it in the philosophy literature on pain. But if you look into the science, there actually is no support for it. It's another one of those things like chicken sexing. So it's interesting. I mean, or if you find a scientist supporting it, they only cite the philosophy papers. And so the support seems to be based on individuals who are taking some type of morphine-like drug or schizophrenic, and of course it's very hard to accept what they have to say. And also interviews have shown actually that they do dislike it. So there isn't this there might not be an actual disconnect in the real world. But yet it does seem to maybe show conceptually we can sort of understand the pain maybe without the attitude, or the attitude without, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think what a lot of people want to say, maybe who haven't looked as carefully as you at the relevant scientific data, but in the philosophical literature on pain asymbolia, is this is just a kind of odd case where there is pain, but it's not unpleasant. And then maybe they would say, like, really what we're talking about is unpleasantness, not pain as such. Maybe it's possible for there to be an experience that's a pain, but that's not unpleasant. If that's the case, then you know, what I would really want to say is it's unpleasant experiences that are intrinsically bad, not necessarily pains.
Yeah. So, okay, so I don't think that science anyway, but that's interesting. But, well, okay. So, well, what about, okay, the zombie case? I mean, on the one hand, there's nothing bad in their experiences. On the other hand, though, it seems like it's wrong when someone in the zombie world, when someone murders another zombie. I mean, or if I were to go there somehow and hurt, that would be, I can't, that would be wrong. You can't just cause pain to a zombie. So you could have that intuition too, I think. It's, I don't know if the intuitions are clear in that case.
Good. Yeah, so I'm not totally sure that it would be wrong to kill a zombie. I mean, of course, there's like, there would always be like some uncertainty, like, are you absolutely sure this is a zombie? And there'd be no conclusive way of finding out. So there's a kind of like moral uncertainty issue there, where like maybe it would be right to decide on the err on the side of caution. But setting aside the uncertainty, I think it's not totally clear that it would be wrong to kill a zombie, and B, we could allow maybe that it's wrong to kill a zombie in a way that is compatible with the no value thesis. I think there's at least going to be a complicated connection between how much value there is in an individual's life and whether it's wrong to kill that individual. So, like if I come upon someone who's got like a bad terminal illness and they're going to live the rest of their lives in excruciating pain. You know, I might judge that there's less that their life has like negative value, but still, like without their consent, it would be wrong for me to kill them. So there's not a totally straightforward connection between the value included in a life and whether it's wrong to kill. You might also think that like, well, like suppose I have just like a beautiful forest or something with no sentient life in it. There seems to be something at least morally perverse about just like destroying it for a trivial reason. And it seems like maybe we can say that without saying that there's any kind of like welfare or value in a significant sense in the existence of the forest. So I think to go from it would be wrong to kill a zombie to therefore the states of the zombie have significant value or disvalue would require some further principles connecting value to deontic notions like wrongness that are at least going to be tricky.
Yeah, certainly there would be some things to say there, like it would be wrong because it makes you more likely to kill or something, and that's not good. But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe because, you know, my background with ballet, I undergo a lot of pain for some type of value. You know, that person who has the terminal illness and is in a lot of pain, well, maybe their life is still valuable because they're going to do something good in the world. You know, they're doing research on trying to discover the cure for some disease, something. So the pain, well, that's just there. And maybe you could say it's something we don't like, but it's not what gives life like, you know, disvalue.
Well, I mean, I assume that like the disvalue associated with excruciating pain might be outweighed by other valuable things, such that all things considered, their life has extreme positive value on the whole. And it could be that the pain has a huge amount of instrumental value that outweighs the intrinsic disvalue of pain. So maybe the pain helps them to become a more virtuous person, and the virtue in their soul has like a value that outshines any amount of disvalue that could come from the pain. I mean, so there's any number of ways in which you could say that a life with pain or even a huge amount of pain is valuable on the whole. But I guess it does seem to me that, you know, if a life consists of nothing but unending excruciating pain with no like outweighing positive benefits, and that's something that's bad on net.
Okay, good, thanks.
And it's bad in a way that like a life of someone just like in a coma or completely unconscious would not be, or just like having neutral gray phenomenology would not be.
Good.
Yeah, thanks.
So Anandi has a question that might fit. I have a quick finger first. So just I put in the chat this lovely book from that some of you may or may not know from Nicola Grayek called Feeling Pain and Being in Pain. Wonderful discussion of pain Issenbolia cases. And contra some of the stuff Barbara was getting at, like I actually think these are very clear examples where patients are like the science is spot on, and the like there's no denying that these are patients who, at least in one class of patients, are saying things like they're in pain but they're not feeling bad, and there's nothing bad about the pain. That was one comment. So there do seem to be such cases, scientifically well supported cases.
I think that the author is sort of cautious though in that book, so I don't think the view disagrees.
In any case, that was just one minor. The more important thing is that, you know, so Brian, you mentioned you're happy for like maybe something like second order states, like, you know, the pain gets to be valuable or disvaluable, whatever the right word is, unvaluable.
Disvaluable.
Yeah, because of, you know, my attitude I take towards it.
Yeah.
That might make it look extrinsic in a certain way, in that it depends not just on its nature, the state, but on my attitude to the state. But why does that matter to you? Who cares? As long as the value claims there, why do you need intrinsicality?
Oh, so it doesn't matter to me. And this is related to the point that intrinsic value, in my sense, is compatible with there being extrinsic conditions on value.
So like,
And so you know, maybe this is why.
well,
Yeah, so this is why some people don't want to use intrinsic value the way I'm using it. They'll talk about like terminal value or value for its own sake.
final
and-
value, yeah.
Yeah, final value. And that's really what I
Just let
have
me
in mind.
encourage that for the sake of referee.
Yeah.
We get annoyed otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. I mean, I'm coming at things from a, you know, the philosophy of mind, metaphysics perspective, and I just find that the intrinsic instrumental distinction like more natural and intuitive. But I think like people who are like really in the depths of value theory and working out like all the different distinctions among value, like that they might balk at my kind of clumsy use of intrinsic when really I mean final. So yeah,
Of course, God, like value theorists now are getting very careful about distinguishing intrinsic from, like, they're making the instrumental, non-instrumental, intrinsic, extrinsic distinction totally separate very carefully.
Yeah, no, and I'm sympathetic with those arguments, and I think you might be right that using the term final value might be better. My main motivation for using intrinsic is just it's a somewhat more familiar term for people outside of value theory, and it gets at least roughly onto what I mean. Even.
Yeah, cool. Start by intrinsic and then say, but strictly speaking, I'm going to say non-instrumental going forward, but now you have a grip on it.
Yeah.
Cool. The question from Anita, please.
It's not a question, it was as it were finger here. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think the more we go on about it, the more I'm losing my grip on intrinsic value. So I started with a simple question, but as the question period is progressed, it's developed a little bit. Let me start with my simple thought. Okay, so I was thinking when you were claiming that there was no value without phenomenal consciousness, I was trying to think of an example before you started using cognitive states. I thought, well, what about if you had a physical, a computational simulation, and the disvalue of what would be excruciating pain would something like be disharmony in the system. So let's say you had disharmony and harmony, and I wondered whether that might count as a kind of value. Then I thought, oh, wait a minute, your response, given what you said to Alex in the beginning, maybe that's a kind of instrumental value. But then I wasn't sure, how we were thinking about intrinsic value. Okay, so that's part of my question. The other part is whether really is it value or no value, or can we say wrong value?
Sorry, what was that last term? Raw
Instead of
value?
saying that
Wrong?
phenomenal consciousness has value and physical systems have no value, could we just say they have different values? And so that it connects with my question about what is an intrinsic value and how do you get a grip on it?
Yeah, good, really interesting. So first on the point of what I mean by intrinsic or non-instrumental value. So instrumental value is just a value that something has in virtue of causing or maybe enabling or allowing something that's valuable in itself. And so I just mean intrinsic value to be kind of the natural contrast of that. So if having money might be instrumentally valuable because it allows us to get entertainment or happiness or whatever. But to say that it has instrumental value is to say that it causally contributes to something that's valuable, not merely in an instrumental way, and that's what I have in mind with intrinsic value. So what you're talking about with maybe like states of kind of causal disharmony within the dynamics of a computational system. So you could think that kind of physical disharmony or computational disharmony is bad in a non-instrumental way.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think that's a coherent view and not a crazy view. And similarly, I think that maybe beautifully elegant physical patterns being instantiated could be good in a non-instrumental way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's I think this is related to why I wanted to formulate the no value thesis, as the physical correlates have either no value or at least nothing like the same amount of value or disvalue as the relevant
Okay, when
phenomenal
you
state.
said same amount, is that like what I'm saying as the wrong value? You're calling it not same amount, and I'm calling it, well, a different kind. I don't know. Can there be different kinds of intrinsic value?
So maybe there can be different kinds of intrinsic value. People distinguish between like aesthetic value and prudential value and moral value. But I guess I still think it's possible in principle, at least in some cases, to make comparisons between values, even if we allow that in some sense they're different kinds. So maybe experiences have a kind of value that's different from mere aesthetic value. But I think at least in some cases we can weigh the value associated with experiences with the value associated with kind of like aesthetic patterns. This actually comes up interestingly in kind of early modern discussions of the problem of evil, and even some current discussions of the problem of evil for theism. So I mean, I think like Leibniz's response to the problem of evil was something like, well, what's really valuable for God is to create the highest amount of like variation or variety grounded in the simplest, most elegant principles, or something along those lines. So multiplicity grounded in simplicity. And a lot of people, I think, nowadays, most philosophers of religion don't take this theodicy very seriously. And in a typical response is something like, okay, like maybe there's a certain kind of aesthetic value to having a world where there's a lot of variety at the high level, grounded in like a few simple, elegant principles at the lower level. But like, if you weigh that aesthetic good against like all the excruciating pain all over the place in the world, it's just like not even, it's nowhere on a par. Like maybe there's some good to having that aesthetic pattern exhibited by the universe, but it doesn't come close to outweighing all the excruciating pain that we get all over the place in the world. So that kind of judgment that this theodicy is like unworkable presupposes, I think, that like we can compare the value associated with negative experiences with mere aesthetic value. And at least in some cases, we can have intuitive support for the claim that there's just way less value associated with exhibiting this aesthetic pattern than there is with, such and such experiences. And in the same way, I guess I'd want to say, this is true even if there's kind of like computational patterns of harmony and disharmony exhibited in simulations that are devoid of phenomenal consciousness. Like it just seems to us that like, suppose I'm running the torture simulation that I was describing, and suppose that we're absolutely certain that there's no experiences going on. It seems plausible to me that there's not a huge amount of badness or disvalue associated with running this simulation. And if we can get even a small amount of kind of real world human benefit from running this simulation, that it's worth doing. Or suppose I'm running the Happy Planet simulation and we're absolutely sure that there's no phenomenal consciousness associated with it. It seems plausible to me that even though there might be some non-zero value associated with like computational harmony or whatever, that there's so little value in it if it's devoid of experience that we would be justified in like turning off the simulation if we could get like even a small amount of tangible real world human benefit from it. And I think those intuitions would be shared by a lot of people, provided that we're absolutely certain that there's no phenomenal consciousness going on in these scenarios.
Can I just make a final observation? It does strike me that what you're trying to do here is rather an interesting thing for the phenomenological, and it kind of parallels in my mind what Davidson was doing on rationality for the cognitive side of our natures, right? So there was this rationality that introduced a distinction, right? So we get this difference of vocabulary or whatever that he wanted to try and drive a wedge. And this introduction of value, it seems to me, doing the work that rationality did for him in that part of our nature, our mental life.
Yeah, interesting. I like that analogy.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so next person in the chat. is, and the queue is going to be, we had Barbara Umerters next.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for the talk. My question actually evolved just so much during the Q&A because several versions of it have already come up, and I kind of, I think some of the things that you said kind of responded to it, but let me just try to put a slightly different costume to it, right? So, I mean, earlier in the talk, you suggested that the argument, either the argument or at least the value thesis, doesn't presuppose hedonism. And to me, sort of during the Q&A, it is looking more and more likely, it looks more and more sort of kind of implausible to me in a way that you're actually not presupposing something like hedonism. But maybe I'm wrong about this. So some of the things that you've said could be kind of responded to by appealing to maybe something like a desire satisfaction theory of well-being or something like that. And yeah, so that's basically sort of the most general way of asking the question. So is it really true that your argument is sort of independent of hedonism? And I have a slightly sort of a more specific version of this question, but maybe we can kick off with this.
Yeah, good. So I guess I would want to hear more about why you think it is committed to hedonism. So my thought is like, you could think that like certain like affectively neutral forms of consciousness have value, maybe less value than pleasant states, but still non-negligible value. This goes back to kind of like the Vulcan thing. So like I think life as a Vulcan would be significantly valuable, especially if there's kind of rich, sophisticated forms of cognitive phenomenology. I would definitely prefer life as a Vulcan to non-existence. And so, and I think like if you're on board with those intuitions that like the Vulcan life has value, I think you could run a version of my argument just by appeal to the intuitive value of non-affective Vulcan phenomenology, because it will seem to us that like the Vulcan's life is better than the zombie counterpart of the Vulcan. So compare a Vulcan and then compare like a zombie counterpart who has just like no phenomenology at all, that the lights are off inside. I think much better to be the Vulcan than the zombie counterpart of the Vulcan. So yeah, so for those reasons, I think that I don't need hedonism, though I guess I want to be ecumenical, and almost everyone will accept that pleasant and unpleasant states are good and bad intrinsically. So I mostly focus on them.
Okay, interesting. I mean, so the case that I was thinking was related to your simulation cases, and you said in the talk, I think, so these zombies that you might simulate or whatever, so they're going to be zombies. They're not going to have any phenomenally conscious states, and suppose you torture them or you simulate torturing or whatever,
yeah.
and I think the intuitions that they're supposed to support the no value thesis are supposed to be like, look, there isn't anything bad about the torture in those cases, at least intrinsically. And you kind of discussed the possible response to that, and you kind of dismissed that response, which is that, look, if these zombies that we simulated actually have a desire not to be tortured, then you could actually say that, well, there's something still bad about it. And then your response to that response, right? So was so it sounded like you were saying either of these things, maybe both of them, I don't know. So one of them is that maybe it is not conceivable at all that there could be such zombies which do really have those desires. Yeah. That's sort of one interpretation, which I think is relatively, it's a very strong claim in some sense, and you kind of need to probably go into cognitive phenomenology or something like that. And to some extent might actually even suggest that maybe zombies are not conceivable, or zombies in the sense that, some people have been using them in other thought experiments. They are not conceivable. But another reading of what you said is, look, maybe there is a conception of zombies which actually allows for the fact that these zombies don't have any cognitive states or cognitive states or whatever, and they are the ones that are relevant to these sort of intuitions. But then I thought, I mean, this is where I thought maybe you are committed to hedonism, but maybe you are not. But I mean, your response to that kind of conception was like, there's still nothing really intrinsically wrong with torturing some zombie, even though they really don't want to be tortured. And I think supporting that claim as an intuitive claim, to me, sounds a lot like departing from hedonism. Because if they really desire not to be, I mean, unless you are kind of just rejecting the possibility, even the conceptual possibility that they are really desiring not to be tortured despite having no consciousness. I mean, yeah, that is, you need something that, you know, as strong as I think, or at least sort of rejecting certain alternatives to hedonism to get that, I think.
I see. Okay, so I think there's a lot of subtleties here. So maybe I'm going to try to sort things out. So, you know, there's a standard kind of three-way division of like the main views on well-being. I think it comes from Parfit, where like hedonism is one of the options, desire satisfaction theory is a second, and then objectiveless is the third. And if you're kind of working with a taxonomy where those are the only options, then some of the things I said might have suggested that desire satisfaction is not normatively significant, which might seem to push me towards hedonism, or at least the disjunction of hedonism and objectiveless. But so one issue here, I think not the most important, but one issue is that even though that's a kind of standard taxonomy from Parfit, it's not at all exhaustive. So hedonism is an instance, is a species of a broader view of well-being, sometimes called experientialism, that the well-being supervenes on experiential states, where those aren't necessarily just the ones with positive and negative valence. They could be like neutrally valenced states. So maybe a way of putting your point, if we think of the natural contrast to desire satisfaction as like experientialism, then maybe you could be pushing me towards at least accepting a kind of experientialism as opposed to desire satisfaction. But I did say I wanted to be even neutral on experientialism. So let me address that. So what I wanted to say about these zombie cases is, so I think maybe there's a purely functional concept of desire, but there's also a not purely functional concept of desire, one that as a conceptual matter involves phenomenology. I tend towards the view that our ordinary concept of desire is of the second kind. But even apart from that, if you agree with me that there's both a purely functional and a not purely functional concept of desire, the question arises, like, which of these two concepts is the normatively significant one? On the assumption, which I'm happy to grant, that desire satisfaction is a normatively significant thing, so that, you know, if a creature strongly desires not to be like poked and prodded, then by poking and prodding them, you're doing something that's bad for them. I want to say that it's the phenomenology involving concept of desire that is the normatively significant one. So the zombie who has no phenomenology whatsoever, I'm happy to say that according to one perfectly good concept of desire, the zombie has desires, and those purely functional desires are being frustrated when the zombie is tortured. But because the purely functional concept of desire is not the normatively significant concept of desire, I don't think it's really significantly bad to have purely functional desires frustrated or thwarted. The thing that I want to say is significantly bad is to have desires in the other sense frustrated or thwarted. And so I want to allow for I want to allow for a kind of desire satisfaction theory, or at least certainly the theory that desire satisfaction and frustration is relevant to well-being, so long as the relevant desires are conceived in a way that like essentially involves phenomenology. And then I suggest that there's two ways in which that might go. One, it might be that they essentially involve cognitive phenomenology. I guess that's sort of the view that I incline towards. But there's another kind of like view associated with like Eric Schwitzgebel and Adam Pautz, and where you say that like the desire is a functional state, but the relevant functional role essentially involves phenomenology, where that phenomenology doesn't have to be cognitive phenomenology. It could be like affective or sensory phenomenology.
No, this is a very complete answer. I'm not gonna respond because I think there's one more question and David has to leave for that.
Yeah,
but thanks.
So there's sorry, there is Maya. Did you ask yours already? In which case there is David Papel.
Thanks. Hi, Brian. Terrific talk. I've got a meta question. So I like the argument. I mean, I think you're dead right. If you're a reductive physicalist, then various counterintuitive consequences follow. You have to deny the no value premise. I've got it right. You've got to deny that the internal perspective is privileged, respecting matters of value, and so on. And I agree entirely. I don't see why that's an argument. I mean, you presented it as an argument against reductive physicalism. I don't see why it's an argument at all. My view is, yeah, exactly right. That's what follows from reductive physicalism. It shows that we've got to get rid of a lot of bad old thoughts that previous non-reductive physicalist ways of thinking about things induced us into ways of thinking that have turned out to be wrong. So, I mean, in the background here is what I take to be the case that there's strong arguments for reductive physicalism based on all kinds of analysis and eventually bottoming out in empirical evidence. And on the other side, you say, well, if you believe that, then a lot of things that I'm inclined to believe are going to have to go. But I don't see why that's an argument. So my question is just a meta question about the status of intuitions. I mean, you were quite explicit in appealing to the fact that the consequences that follow were counterintuitive, and you took that to be an argument against reductive physicalism. So I'm just puzzled about what you take counterintuitive to mean, such that it has that argumentative weight.
Good. Yeah, so maybe I should say something about like the background epistemological assumptions or metaphilosophical or methodological assumptions. So I do assume that intuition, understood as like a kind of intellectual appearance where things intellectually seem to be such and such, that the intuitions have a kind of epistemic value. They carry justificatory force. They provide some defeasible reason to accept their content. So I think in this sense, I accept that intellectual appearances have the kind of epistemic status that most would accord to perceptual appearances. Most would say that if it perceptually seems to you that P, then that gives you defeasible grounds for accepting that P. I think we should extend that to intuitions understood as a kind of an intellectual appearance. And I guess the reason I think that is it just seems like there's tons of things that we seem plausibly justified in believing that I can't see a good explanation for how we could be justified in believing them if intuitions had no epistemic value or justificatory force. So, you know, even the idea that like excruciating pain is worse than happiness, that's something that I think is true. I don't think that we have like empirical justification for believing these normative claims. They also don't seem to be like analytic, and so they're kind of synthetic claim that seems like that our justification for believing them stems from kind of the way things seem intellectually or in intuition. So I am assuming as a kind of like background epistemological assumption that intuitions have epistemic value. I mean, maybe there's a kind of like ad hominem response here that would be that it's hard to see how reductive materialism could be motivated in the first place without some reliance on intuition or a priori assessments of plausibility. So take like the kind of like causal completeness style or causal exclusion style arguments for reductive materialism. So these aren't going to get you. I mean, so like the mere empirical claim that, you know, some physical state of the brain plays the causal role that we thought an experience played by itself is not going to get you reductive materialism. You're also going to need a kind of like anti-epiphenomenalist claim and a kind of no overdetermination claim. And in each of these cases, it's hard to see how those further premises could be justified in a purely empirical way. I suspect there's going to be some irreducible role for kind of like rationalist or synthetic a priori considerations to kind of argue maybe on simplicity grounds that the overdeterminationist dualism is less likely to be true than the reductive materialist view. So I suspect that the motivations that lead one to reductive materialism in the first place are going to rely to some extent on these kind of a priori and intuitive considerations, at least at some stage in the argument. So I'm skeptical that there could even be a well-motivated form of reductive materialism that's completely skeptical about the value of these kind of a priori epistemic sources of justification.
Okay, there's going to be lots of cases and cases. You mentioned two kinds of intuitions, which I certainly don't want to disagree with you about the badness of pain and virtues of simplicity in theoretical choice, and we could talk about those. But those weren't the ones that you were using in this argument. But I just want to try another general question, now a meta question. Okay, how's it possible? I mean, this is an old-fashioned question. I mean, I take it that these intuitions are giving us synthetic knowledge that doesn't kind of fall out of the structure of our concept. How is it possible that we could have a priori reliable access to facts of that kind?
Yeah. That's a good question, a very deep question. I don't have a general answer to that. I mean, I do think that the question is more pressing for someone who accepts a kind of thoroughgoing naturalism about the universe and human beings and their place in it. From that kind of perspective, it really does look kind of incongruous to think that we have like powers of rational insight that can give us knowledge or justified belief apart from the deliverances of sense experience. I think there's a tension with a kind of naturalism, certainly. I'm not convinced that the broad naturalistic picture of the universe is sufficiently well motivated for us to conclude, therefore we don't have synthetic a priori knowledge. I'm inclined to think it's more plausible just on the force of the many plausible examples of synthetic a priori claims that we know or seem to be highly justified in believing. It's more plausible if we have to choose between like naturalism and synthetic a priori knowledge to reject a kind of thoroughgoing naturalistic conception of the universe and the human mind and our place in it. But that's a really big issue. Yeah, and to get into that, I think I would just need to get into like the many plausible examples I think there are of synthetic a priori knowledge or justified belief, and I think in practice that I think there's a kind of like ad hominem move to make. I think in practice, if you look in detail at the sorts of reasoning that would lead one to a kind of naturalistic picture of the universe, they're going to make, the reasoning is going to make ineliminable use of kind of synthetic a priori principles at some stage in the reasoning if you make it fully explicit. So I think there's something potentially self-undermining about rejecting the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge on the basis of naturalism. But yeah, I mean, this is like a huge issue. I mean, in a way, I think this is like one of the most foundational issues in all of philosophy. So I probably can't say anything very adequate to it here.
Good, that was great.
Okay, I think that's all the questions gone through within time. We're 10 minutes over, so unless anybody has anything else, we should thank the speaker for a wonderful talk. Brian, cheers.
Thank you, and thanks Alex and Umut for organizing this and inviting me.
Thanks a lot. I think we had a question from Dan, but maybe Dan, I mean, it depends on.
It's up to you, Brian, if you want.
I'm happy to stick around, or if you want to like officially end it. But
I'll stick
around for.
I will stop the live stream and to finish the meeting, but we can stick around for 5 more minutes if that's okay with people.